We often think about mass migration as like a modern thing, But today's deep dive, it takes us way back,
Bang.
back to the late 1800s.
Yeah.
And it's a story that might feel, well, surprisingly familiar. We're going to look at a wave of Jewish immigration. It was sparked by hardship, sure, but also fueled by this powerful, powerful idea.
Yeah.
Return. And specifically, return to their ancient homeland, Ottoman Palestine.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here is that this wasn't just about getting away from a bad situation, right? It was more than that. Our guide for this, Leah Portal, she, in her Substack post, it's called We All Came From Somewhere, she connects this big historical event to her own family's story. And it adds this really powerful personal layer to it all, It's a good reminder that history, it's not just dates and names in a book. It's about, the actual lived experience of people, the people who came before us.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. We're talking 1881, Russia. Imagine like a powder keg of social unrest. Right?
Oh, yeah.
And we've seen this throughout history when tensions are high, there's almost always a scapegoat.
Right.
In this case, it was the Jewish population.
Yeah.
And they were already living under all these restrictions, confined to the Pale of Settlement.
Yeah, the Pale of Settlement. So this was this designated area within Russia where Jews were allowed to live. But even then, even within that area, their freedoms were really limited. And then you have the assassination of Tsar Alexander II.
Right, a huge turning point.
Yeah, exactly. And here's the thing, even though this was a major event, it didn't just magically erase all the underlying tensions that were already there.
Yeah.
If anything, it just made them worse, way worse.
It's like throwing gasoline on a fire.
Exactly.
And that's where those May laws come into play, right? I have to admit, I've always been a little fuzzy on the specifics.
Sure. So basically, the May laws were a bunch of decrees, right? They were enacted after the assassination, and they specifically targeted the Jewish community. We're talking about restrictions on where they could live, what jobs they could have. They even limited their access to education.
Wow.
It was this systematic way of taking away their rights. And it was all fueled by fear and prejudice, plain and simple.
It's a stark reminder, isn't it? How quickly things can turn ugly when fear takes over.
It is.
So you have this pressure cooker situation, social unrest, scapegoating, and now increasingly oppressive laws. It's no wonder that people wanted out.
Totally. And you can see why for many, the United States seemed like, well, the obvious choice. It was this beacon of freedom, of opportunity. We're talking, around 4.5 million Jewish immigrants went to the U.S. around this time, the late 19th and early 20th centuries. A massive wave.
Huge numbers. But what always gets me about this story and why I find it so interesting is that not everyone went to America.
Right.
Aliyah points out that a smaller group, but still significant, don't get me wrong, set their sights on a very different destination, Ottoman Palestine. And this is where it gets really interesting to me, because Aliyah, she even describes Palestine at that time as being full of swamps in the north and arid desert in the south. Not exactly the most enticing picture.
Yeah. No, not exactly a land of opportunity, at least at first glance, right? It makes you think, right, why choose this place, Palestine, I mean? Under Ottoman rule, it's a world away. Why leave one hard place for another?
Yeah, exactly. It's not the obvious choice, is it?
Right. And that's where the pull factor comes in. See, for a lot of these immigrants, it wasn't just about escaping. This wasn't just about running from something. This was about something much, much deeper. It was about the idea of going back, returning to their ancient homeland, the land of their ancestors. They were driven by centuries of history and faith, cultural identity.
It's like they weren't just looking for a new home, right? Yeah. This was about reconnecting with something much bigger than themselves. It adds a whole other layer, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. It adds so much. And speaking of layers, Aliyah, she uses a really specific term when she talks about this migration. She calls it Aliyah.
I was kind of hoping you'd bring that up. Because I got to admit, when I first saw that word in Aliyah's post, I kind of glossed over it. But then I thought, I bet I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
So for those of us who might not be familiar, could you talk a bit about that word? What's its significance?
Oh, absolutely. Aliyah. It's not just a synonym for immigration. It's way more loaded than that. The literal translation is more like coming up or ascending. It gets at this idea of a spiritual return, a physical and spiritual kind of elevation. That's all bound up in this idea of Jews returning to their ancestral land.
Wow, that's amazing. Even the language itself has this deeper meaning baked in. Really underscores how profound this whole movement was.
It really does. And the thing is, this wasn't just a one-time thing. This wave of immigration to Palestine, it went on for decades.
Yeah.
Aliyah, she talks about these distinct waves. The first Aliyah, the second, the third. Each one had its own thing going on, different motivations, different challenges, but they were all united by this powerful, powerful idea of return.
It really challenges how we think about history, doesn't it? We tend to think of these mass migrations, these big movements fueled by ideology as modern things. But here we have a case study from over a century ago, and it has all these parallels to what's going on in the world today.
Absolutely. It just shows you this human need to belong, to connect to something bigger than yourself, to have a place to call home. And I mean, really call home, you know?
It really does. And it makes you wonder about the people who made this journey,
Mm-hmm.
you know? What was it like for them, leaving everything they knew, everything familiar, to take this leap into, well, the unknown? It must have been so daunting. Aliyah touches on her own family's experience with this, right?
She does, yeah. She talks about like these family stories about arriving in Palestine, and it's not what they expected at all.
Yeah, it's easy to, romanticize the past. We imagine these journeys as like these purely idealistic things, right?
Right.
But Aliyah does a good job of reminding us that the reality, well, it was often way harsher. These immigrants, they had to deal with so much disease, poverty, cultural clashes. There was even resistance from the people who already lived there. It wasn't easy, that's for sure. It's what makes it such a powerful story, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, they were heading into the unknown, driven by this powerful idea, yeah, but also facing some very real, very difficult obstacles. And that description Aliyah gives of Palestine at the time, it always sticks with me, those swamps and arid desert, she calls it. It really makes you think if a place like that could hold such allure because of what it represented to them, that really says something about the power of belief, of identity.
It really does. It makes you stop and think about the choices we make, even when we're up against incredible odds. Like, what drives us? What are those deeper motivations? What are the dreams, the fears, the hopes that are shaping our journeys, our own personal journeys, but also like our collective ones, you know?
It's like that saying, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Yeah. But on this like generational scale, even a historical scale maybe, I don't know, it's just, here we are all these years later, and we're still grappling with so many of the same things. Migration, identity, belonging. It really makes you wonder, how much do we really know about the journeys of those who came before us? And how have their journeys shaped our own? How have they shaped our sense of place in the world?
It's a great question, one worth thinking about for sure. And I think that's the thing about history. It's not just in textbooks, you know? It's alive in us. It shapes how we see things, what we value, even if we're not aware of it.
It's like we're all carrying around these invisible family trees, reaching way back, with roots in different parts of the world. And sometimes it takes something like this deep dive, this conversation, to help us remember those roots, and to remember the journeys that got us to where we are.
It's a journey of discovery, absolutely. And who knows, maybe, just maybe, if we understand the past a little better, we can find a better way through the present and into whatever the future holds.
I think so, yeah. Well said. And on that note, a huge thank you to Aliyah Portal for her work, her writing. She's a fantastic writer.
Sure.
And for reminding us that history is more than just dates and events. It's about the stories of the people.
And those stories, they still resonate today.
They do. Okay, that's it for today's deep dive. Thanks for listening, everybody.